The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The March Against Monsanto is happening this Saturday, May 24th. You can check the march-against-monsanto.com website for information about local events. I've been asked by a few viewers to comment on this, and they were wondering why have I not been talking about this March Against Monsanto. I agree with many of the grievances of many of those protesters at these marches against Monsanto, and this includes the bullying influence of companies like Monsanto, the lawsuits against farmers who, merely by virtue of having an adjacent field to one that has Monsanto trademarked soybeans planted, wind blows and some of those get planted in a small farmer's field inadvertently, and the farmer gets sued and their small family farm is ruined. The Monsanto lobbying efforts to prevent full disclosure and mandatory labeling on products. I am 100% behind all of that stuff. However, the blind anti-GMO component of the March Against Monsanto does not appeal to me, not because I'm a cheerleader of GMOs, but because, Lewis, we've had interviews on this program with actual scientists who have told us that the one study that is often pointed to in terms of the harmful effects of GMOs on rats was a flawed study that we can't really consider as evidence, and that we don't really have science that tells us in the abstract genetically modified foods are bad for human health. I'm not rejecting the idea, but I think it's very important when we're going to organize, when we're going to activate against corporations or individuals or organizations, that we know exactly what it is we're talking about and asking for and protesting against. And on the GMO issue, according to many of the scientists we've talked to, reputable scientists, we just don't really have the science where I would be out saying GMOs are just flat out bad for everyone's health.
That is true. But at the same time, we don't have scientists telling us that they're perfectly harmless either. I think the general consensus is that we just don't know yet.
We don't know. You're exactly right. But then, therefore, I'm not really comfortable. I would be out there protesting, saying we need studies right away, including on the short, medium, and long-term effect of GMO consumption in humans. But I wouldn't be out there saying GMO foods are bad, period. And there are many cases of GMO foods actually being very important in poor areas of the world where nutrition is something that, where food is definitely in short supply. And I don't feel comfortable advocating for protest on something where I don't believe we have all the facts.
Fair enough. But I think it is just as good a reason to protest on something that is widely produced and distributed throughout the country and is ending up on many people's plates, simply because we don't have all the facts.
Certainly.
So it kind of goes both ways. I'm not going to side with the people who say that this stuff kills. Of course, you're right there. But I still think it's a bit unnerving that we just don't really know about it, but we're still eating it.
We need to know more, no question about it, about the effects on humans of eating GMO foods. However, to be blindly against GMOs strictly on the basis that they are bad for human health, in the absence of true science telling us that, I think is not a good idea for anybody who wants to be taken seriously as a protester, as an activist. Here's an interesting story. Lewis, we know about OSHA. OSHA is a regulation organization that seeks to work on workplace safety and safety regulations for employees in all sorts of different companies. Back in the 2012 presidential campaign, Wisconsin businessman Lance Johnson said that President Obama's workplace safety regulations were burdening him and that inspectors were killing jobs with too much red tape. He said, "I've never been audited by more government agencies in my life than I have been under Obama." He's the president of Johnson Brass and Machine Foundry Incorporated in Saukville, Wisconsin. And he also said that he just has these aggressive regulators that are causing him huge problems. Johnson claimed that the cost of dealing with these so-called unnecessary OSHA audits went well into the six figures. And he said that they were duplicative, that they were looking at the same thing time and time again, which OSHA disputed. So the bad news and it is ironic in a sense, but really it's just bad news, is that earlier this week, Johnson's foundry was the site of a horrific industrial accident. As reported by the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, a catastrophic failure of machinery sprayed molten metal on workers, injuring 8, sending 4 of them to the hospital. And this is one of those situations where we hear the complaints saying regulation is too strict, and then we actually see that those complaining about the regulations have an accident like this. Now, of course, individual accidents can happen anywhere, but the issue is that if we look at the penalties that this foundry received, they were hit with proposed penalties of just under $10,000 for exposing workers to hazards back in 2011. So-called small government, hands-off business conservatives think that these regulations get in the way of profit. As it turns out, Lewis, the regulations and the fines weren't even enough to prevent this accident.
Right. A lot of people just call this big government overreach. I mean, in reality, OSHA is here for more than anything to protect employees from business owners who would cut corners and put their safety at risk just to save money.
People like Lance Johnson love to complain about how regulation of any kind is bad for business. What he doesn't mention is that for all of the duplicative auditing he claims to have been the victim of, all he received was a proposed minor fine, which, by the way, seems to never have been actually paid, and no demand to correct the dangerous conditions. In other words, the enforcement from the government was not nearly strict enough, yet he continued to complain that it was all just completely oppressive. This is another one of those areas where right-wingers like to say the government doesn't need to be involved. The private companies have an interest themselves to make their workplaces as safe as possible. And this is laughable, Lewis. We have example after example that proves that does not happen.
Right. Luckily, in general, there are plenty of business owners who don't have a problem with this, who abide by the rules and understand it. I'm glad we don't have a mass rebellion against OSHA.
Republican Governor Tom Corbett ended his fight last night to stop same-sex marriage in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is now the 19th state, plus D.C., to recognize same-sex marriages. It is the last northeastern U.S. state to do so. We are getting closer and closer to half of all states, Lewis, having same-sex marriage legalized. And it says a lot when Corbett, a Catholic, a Republican, someone who says his personal beliefs are anti-gay, says, you know what? I'm not going to oppose this. That's just huge. I don't know how else to say it.
Right. You're just going with the flow, I guess. I mean, there comes a time when you just have to take up arms with a different battle, one that you maybe can win.
Well, a lot of people in Pennsylvania who know the political climate are saying he has a tough re-election campaign coming up, so that this was a decision made to help him in that. I think that says a lot. When you have to go against your anti-gay, religious-based beliefs and favor equality because the reaction from voters would be negative if you didn't, that is real progress. Maybe not from Corbett. From Corbett, it's just pragmatism, but that's real progress from the electorate.
And I assume that's the direction we're headed in for all Republicans. I mean, if they don't start appealing to the public sentiment, then what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, Corbett has to evolve on his personal views, right? 65% of American Catholics, 80% of American Jews support same-sex marriage. Evangelicals still not too thrilled with it. He's choosing to follow an anti-gay version of his faith. It's just a choice. He could change that right away.
Who knows? I'm sure there's any number of things he could do, David, but I'm glad that he has to go with the public on this one.
A Florida sheriff's news conference about gun violence was interrupted by gunshots in the background. Listen to this.
Conditions of such that they really should be...
Shots rang out just as Orange County Sheriff was trying to bring attention to the increase in crime.
All right, that was Sheriff Jerry Demings and Orange County Commissioner Tiffany Moore Russell. They were talking about Orlando's Timberskin Apartments, where homicides have been reported this year. Deputies get 6 calls a day. And he went on to say, I don't know if that's gunfire or what we hear in the background, but that's part of the challenges we have. Water and power are going to be cut off to many of the residents in the coming weeks. Their trash is piling up. It is not a good situation. Lewis, did you ever experience this during your time in Florida? Just shots ringing out, but then everybody reacting very casually, as if it's not even really that surprising or that big of a deal?
No, I never actually heard gunfire. I was right near Orlando. There were shootings all the time. There were deaths all the time, all sorts of crime, helicopters looking for people constantly. And it was, I didn't really let it get to me, but it's a huge problem in Central Florida.
Wayne LaPierre has assured us from the NRA, those weren't gunshots, Lewis. They were bursts of freedom.
That's a good one. Yeah, I'm sure that's what they consider it.
And by the way, those getting in the way of those freedom bursts did so at the risk of violating Florida laws against getting in the way of stand your ground freedom bursts. Purely logistical question, though. Who owns these apartments? How come the landlords, Lewis, don't take some responsibility of the circumstances, get the trash picked up? I mean, what's going on?
I'm not really sure. Maybe they don't want to get shot. Maybe they've completely given up and abandoned the place altogether.
The Alex Jones crowd might call this a false flag just to make it seem like gun violence is a problem as an attempt to create a pretext to grab guns. Of course, that's ridiculous, but you should look at my inbox every day. Let's take a break. We'll be back after this. We've got a great recommendation for you today and a great interview coming up as well.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to The David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show membership program is made possible in part by liberalbias.com, which is producing a new weekly video feature on their YouTube channel, Liberal Bias Video, to get the latest updates on how to uncover liberal bias in the world. Subscribe to Liberal Bias Video on YouTube. Today's new member of the day is Brian Duffel. Brian, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. You can join Brian. Remember, this program is mostly viewer supported by going to davidpakman.com/membership and signing up today. Today's recommendation is a little bit different. Usually it's a book, website, or film. Today, it is a play. Earlier this week, I was thrilled to see the play All the Way, featuring Bryan Cranston as Lyndon Baines Johnson. It is a great, great story. It basically starts right after the assassination of JFK and goes to LBJ's election in 1964. Martin Luther King plays a prominent role in the story. Some people there, Lewis, had no idea who Bryan Cranston was, had never even heard of Breaking Bad. During the intermission, I heard people saying, so one of the actors is like someone from TV? And then the friend said, yeah, the guy who plays LBJ. And they said, oh, really? What show? Oh, this show Breaking Bad. Huh, never heard of it. So interestingly enough, I assumed a lot of people would be going to see it because of the fame Bryan Cranston developed by playing Walter White in Breaking Bad. But a lot of people just going because they heard it was a great play, which it is.
Right. I think perhaps you have worlds colliding there at a play like that. At first, for me, Bryan Cranston was always the dad from Malcolm in the Middle, in which he did an incredibly good job. He stole the show.
See, for me, I never saw that show. So for me, before Breaking Bad, Bryan Cranston was Tim Whatley, the dentist in Seinfeld.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's where it all started. But, that was just one episode. Well, I guess he was in, was it more than one episode?
I think there were maybe two or three episodes where he appeared in Seinfeld. Yeah.
But of course, just overall a great career. I'm very curious to see this play. Absolutely
excellent play. If you can make it to New York City, I highly, highly recommend it. We talked last week about an article in which the Washington Post argued, one author in the Washington Post argued that there was no real split in the Republican Party because everyone in the Republican Party has more or less the same position on most issues. And I disagreed. I said, listen, even if most Republicans have similar or identical views on a plurality of issues, they value those issues very differently, and it leads every election cycle to very different candidates supported for the Republican nomination for president by each wing of the Republican Party. A new poll further confirms that there is a rift in the Republican Party. The number of Republicans who call themselves supporters of the Tea Party has dropped 20 points in the last 4 years, according to a new Gallup survey. The survey found 41% of registered Republicans and Republican-leaning independents say that they support the Tea Party. This is a huge drop from when Gallup polled Republicans in November of 2010 and had 61% of registered Republicans supporting or associating themselves as Tea Party supporters. Remember, this is within the Republican Party, not amongst all supporters. We know, Lewis, that support and favorability for the Tea Party overall has basically fallen off of a cliff in recent years. But what this confirms is that even within the Republican Party, that support has eroded. More evidence of the fracturing of the Republican Party. But as usual, the question is, will it matter in general elections against Democrats? It may in some cases, in others it may not.
Yeah, I don't know. It's going to be a vicious battle in the primary, I'm sure. And that's never a good thing for whoever is trying to reach the presidency. Or, I'm sorry, in this case, just the midterms. But overall, and I don't know, I think that it's funny how it comes down to how voters prioritize issues in the Republican Party.
Well, for all of the negatives of the Democratic Party, and there are many, and we talk about them all the time, when you have a party based on the idea of inclusion in some ostensible way, you're going to have less disagreement because you want to include as many views as possible. When your party, like the Republican Party, is based on exclusion, you are going to have so-called outsiders who deserve to be punished, either through the judicial system, either by being ostracized and boycotted or whatever the case is. So I'm not at all surprised that you have a huge rift developing within the Republican Party, because some, based on the teachings of our founding fathers, need to exclude those who don't subscribe to their worldview. Some, based on what their God tells them, need to exclude others. This is actually pretty logical.
It is, but it's also a party that's in kind of a desperate state right now because they know that overall they're losing, although, that might not be the case in the midterms here. But overall, they need to change their entire system to have a chance in the future.
The other thing is we don't really have to call it the Tea Party, and this is also kind of a semantic thing. We could just say radical Republicans versus pro-business Republicans versus religious Republicans. The Tea Party is just a name, and I think we have to remember, even when we try to argue the Tea Party may not exist in the same form or whatever, the Tea Party views are still just as strongly represented within the party.
Yeah, and it's interesting how big of an impact a simple label can have, regardless of the views of the people who categorize themselves under that label. It's like automatically dividing party lines when you just create these labels and attach them to people and things.
Things are getting out of control in Turkey regarding a mine disaster, and some are saying, hey, let's just blame the Jews. Erdogan is the current prime minister of Turkey, and a conservative newspaper that supports Turkey's prime minister went on this insane anti-Semitic diatribe about a recent mine disaster, which killed 301 people, according to the International Business Times. The article was on the front page of Yeni Akit earlier this week, and it declared, listen to this, the son-in-law of Alp Gürkan, the owner of the Soma mine where the disaster occurred, is reportedly a Jew. The paper was, of course, condemned on social media. By some, others thought that it was actually a great argument that was being made. So this is the translation that we have. Listen to this. While the cartel media, which have Jewish partners, and the parallel media, which are in love with Jews, and the Western media, guided by Jews, are accusing the prime minister over the Soma disaster, it has been revealed that the son-in-law of Alp Gürkan, the owner of the mining company responsible for the disaster, is a Jew, and he changed his name to Mahir. It was written in Yeni Akit, according to the translation. The paper is a successor to another paper that was forced to close after its owner was sued for defaming the military and was fined for describing gay people as perverts. You can always just resort to blaming the Jews, right, Lewis? Hey, the owner's son-in-law by marriage is reportedly Jewish. That's really the issue here. There's a Jew somewhere involved.
hey, if this was some type of safety issue, I think it's perfectly legitimate to start pointing fingers at the owners of the mine. But the fact that their religion should really have nothing to do with it.
And especially when we're talking about the religion of the son-in-law of the owner of the mine. I mean, the religion of the son would be perfectly legitimate, but the son-in-law, Lewis, as we know, that's absolutely ridiculous. My prediction, some of our viewers defend the Jew blaming. Anytime we talk about Jews, more or less half of the YouTube comments are anti-Semitic. And people agree with this stuff. We did the story a week or two ago saying that this new study shows 1 in 4 adults in countries surveyed hold anti-Semitic beliefs. About half of the responses we received to that story were messages that contained anti-Semitic stereotypes or claims.
Yep, it's incredible, but we have to keep reporting on this stuff, and we have to try and, I don't know, level people off a little bit here.
Why do you think, Lewis, that it is way more acceptable to be anti-Semitic than to be against other minority groups? I have different speculations.
Because so many people are anti-Semitic. I mean, that's why. You're just part of a bigger group when you're acting that way, when you say those things. It's more accepted because it's more common, it's more prominent.
We're going to have, I know that anytime Jews come up, there are questions about, David, I thought you were atheist or agnostic. How can you be agnostic and Jewish? And we've explained that, of course, Jews are an ethno-religious group, and I identify with the ethnic and cultural side of that. We're going to actually have someone on the program to explain to us more about that, and also to talk about a history of anti-Semitism and a bunch of other stuff. I think it's going to be fascinating, and we already know, Lewis, about half of the response to that interview will be anti-Semitic. Next, we will have an interview talking about climate change McCarthyism, and a so-called litmus test to be a respected climate scientist. I have a feeling I may not agree with the guest. That's next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'm joined today by Rupert Darwall. He is author of The Age of Global Warming, A History, which is the first book to chart the history of climate change in terms of the ideas, politics, and diplomacy which went to form it and explain how it has panned out. Rupert, it's a pleasure to speak with you. You have an article in National Review which says that there is a sort of McCarthyism that has developed around climate change and climate change science. Let's start there. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, what I meant was actually, I quoted from a letter by an eminent meteorologist, Leonard Bengtsson, who about a month ago joined an avowedly skeptical London-based think tank, the Global Warming Policy Foundation. And 3 weeks later, he resigned because of pressure from colleagues who said they wouldn't cooperate with him and were evidently quite upset about this. And he described their reaction to him as McCarthyite.
And what did you mean by that? In other words, by being, what are we saying broadly, I guess, about climate science, right? By being skeptical that there is climate change happening, or that humans have a role that is a factor in climate change, there is a sort of very kind of like a litmus test from so-called establishment scientists, or what really are we saying?
David, I think litmus test puts it very well. And the problem with climate science, or the phenomenon of climate science, is that it's not just a body of knowledge for its own sake. For example, if we take evolution has very little impact on public policy. However, climate science is, if you like, the feedstock for a political program, which involves radical decarbonisation of emission cuts and so forth. And a lot of people believe that this isn't just about seeking the truth of what is happening to global temperatures. This is a mission to save the planet. And when you have a mission bound up with knowledge, inevitably there is a compromise, if you like, and some would say a corruption of the pure pursuit of knowledge, which might in some ways jeopardize or undermine the advocacy function of science in terms of the political program.
Certainly, and speaking conceptually, I couldn't disagree with anything you've said, that there are mechanisms by which the pursuit of what is ultimately the accurate knowledge or true facts can be corrupted by various influences. The problem I have is when I dug into the specifics of your article, which we'll post a link to on our YouTube channel for everybody to see, is that, for example, you write about the pause in global temperature increase in the last 15 years, that it's been unexpected, and that this has been something that so-called establishment science is not really willing to accept. I researched this specifically because I thought, what better than to look at some of the specific arguments being made by climate change skeptics. As it turns out, that assertion that temperature has stopped increasing over the last 15 or so years is based specifically on cherry-picking 1998, which happened to be the warmest year in the last century, and then simply saying that subsequent years have not been as warm. It is completely not based in the scientific process to say, let's pick an outlier, in this particular case, 1998, and say, since subsequent years haven't been as warm, clearly establishment climate scientists are ignoring the reality that temperature is no longer increasing. I feel that it is a distortion to make that claim.
David, first of all, the most recent IPCC statements have acknowledged what they call a hiatus, and they call it 15 years long. The second point, which I think is more important in many ways, is not whether there has been a pause for 15 to 17 years. and there can be debates about that, although the IPCC itself is pretty clear on that. The far more important point is that computer model projections run hotter than the observations, and there is a growing divergence between what was expected from the climate models, from the outputs of the climate models, and of what actually happened. And that was that's what Bengtson wrote this, submitted a paper.
That's true, but again, what you're ignoring there, Rupert, and I don't know what's in your mind, right? I don't want to accuse you of ignoring this deliberately or simply ignoring it because you aren't aware of it. The IPCC has already addressed this, and they've said that, yes, it's true. The outlier of 1998 and some hot years during the 90s did create a slightly higher projection of temperature increase than what we have seen. Yeah. And it is merely the result of choosing some particularly hot years in the 90s, but it does not actually alter the overall projections that they make. And remember, that's what the IPCC does, projections, not predictions.
Yeah, I have to say, when you get into the theology of the difference between a projection and prediction, I kind of slightly get lost. I mean, I can understand that it's partly to do that they don't know how much forcing there will be, the quantum of greenhouse gases there might be in the atmosphere, because it depends on the economy and so forth.
Certainly, but without getting into that, I guess my point is, which would be the best for you to respond to, is that the claim you're making about the inaccuracy of the IPCC has already been very specifically addressed by scientists.
No, I don't think that is the case. When it may have been addressed by scientists, but coming back to the Bengtson point, that he was alert, he raised the issue that there is a gap between the model outputs and observations. Now, we two can have an argument about that.
Sure.
That's, this is a very eminent meteorologist, and he is making the point, neither of us do. And what's interesting is the reaction to him making that point, which was extremely hostile.
Well, I think maybe this is a good point to segue into the broader question, right? Which is this question of broader consensus on this issue compared to so-called reputable climate scientists who are admittedly outliers being subjected to a so-called litmus test or sort of McCarthyism. I think it's a bit of misnomer to say that they're in any way kind of being discriminated against, because could it not be, and I ask this honestly, not rhetorically or not implying anything, could it not be, Rupert, that because there is this 97% to 3% consensus on the issue of humans and climate change, that it would be simply very difficult for scientists who are part of that 97% to work with someone who's in the 3%, because what they believe seems to go against the overwhelming majority of scientific evidence? Could it be that and not any McCarthyistic litmus test?
Well, I have to say, in a way, kind of what you've described is a litmus test. I mean, you can delete McCarthyite, but Rupert, it's a litmus test in the same sense that if you're going to be an anesthesiologist working in a surgery room, if your views on anesthesiology are that you don't really need the equipment because God will prevent the patient from feeling pain, yeah, that's a litmus test that if that's what you believe, you can't be in the surgery room, right? I mean, just because we can call something a litmus test doesn't mean that it's bad. Yeah, but David, there's a marked difference that in the case of Bengtson, he's a 79-year-old scientist who has been eminent in his field, and there's been no question about his credentials or his seriousness as a scientist.
That's perfectly fair, but what about the countless others who are just as eminent, but you are discrediting because they have a different view?
No, the issue with Bengtson was not that he raised this question of the divergence between model outputs and observations. What people objected very strongly to what his conduct was him joining an advisory board of a skeptical think tank. So this is not about whether his credentials as a scientist, his capabilities as a scientist. This was to do with who he chose to associate with.
All right, we will have to leave it there for today. We've been speaking with Rupert Darwall, author of The Age of Global Warming, A History. Really great to have you on, even if we don't agree on much of this.
Disagreement is entirely legitimate, David.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Jody Heiss is a pastor, a talk radio host, and one of the Republicans in a runoff to replace Congressman Paul Brown, or Brune, I don't know how he pronounces it, from Georgia. And he is saying that the gay community has a secret plan to sodomize children. Let's step back for a second. To give you a little bit of the flavor of the person he's trying to replace, Paul Brune has said, evolution is a lie, straight from the pit of hell. The earth is 9,000 years old. He has boasted about killing a lion and said that it was kind of chewy when he ate it. And he also laughed at a town hall when someone asked him, when is someone going to shoot Obama? He thought that was funny. Okay, that's who Jody Heiss is trying to replace. So there's a pretty high bar set here, or pretty low, depending on how you consider it. So there's this book called It's Now or Never, A Call to Reclaim America. And Heiss quotes an essay by a gay man explaining how gay people want to sodomize your children. And he quotes, "We shall sodomize your son, emblems of your feeble masculinity, of your shallow dreams and vulgar lies." And it goes on, talking about seducing them in locker rooms and dormitories and everywhere. Unfortunately, Lewis, we don't really need to debunk it, since the entire essay quoted is just satirical in nature. Apparently, that didn't bother Jody Heiss, or at least he didn't think to check, and published it as evidence that gay people want to sodomize your children.
Someone probably just handed him this one sentence and said, oh, wow, look at this. Here's all your evidence. Read this to them and they'll love it. It's like the guy who took that study that was a fake article that said 30-something people died the first day marijuana was legalized for recreational use in Colorado. Right over his head, too.
Heiss has also argued that Muslims shouldn't have First Amendment rights, that anybody who supports abortion rights is worse than Hitler, etc. this is a serious race to see if Paul Brune, I wish I knew how he said his last name, whether Paul is going to be replaced by someone with an even more pronounced total lack of connection to reality. And we may have found that person in Jody Heiss.
Maybe. It's an interesting time for those in Georgia. This is Georgia, right?
All right, bullfighting. Lewis, what's your thought on bullfighting? Inhumane, entertaining, what do you think?
Not a fan, David. I'd prefer it if the bulls weren't being killed. It's probably just as impressive to, I don't know, dodge them and do your thing. I don't know why you need to stick a sword through them. But then again, this is an ancient tradition, and maybe I'm not the guy to be commenting on it. Well,
there's a major bullfighting is really big in Spain, and I've mentioned that my dad's wife is from Spain, so I'll have some personal stories about this in a second. There's a major event in Spain in Madrid's bullfighting season. Unfortunately, it's been canceled because all three of the matadors set to participate were gored by bulls. David Mora suffered the worst injuries as one of the animals rammed its horn into his leg and tossed him into the air. He was said to be in serious but not life-threatening condition. And the organizer said this is the first time in 35 years that the event has to be suspended. About 2,000 bullfights are held every year in Spain, but numbers are falling. Bullfighting, as Lewis mentioned, dates back 4,000 years and is thought to have been popularized by the Romans. So my dad's wife is from Spain. They've gone to bullfights. I never have. They claim that, listen, by they, I don't mean my dad and his wife. I mean people in Spain. They say it's not really that inhumane. The bull is eaten later on at nearby restaurants. The food is not wasted. And I completely reject this. The way in which the bull is killed is completely painful and drawn out, and it is inhumane. And even my dad's wife admits that it is somewhat barbaric, but she says, I've grown up with this as the background for a long time. So for me, I just realized that I'm somewhat desensitized to it, but I will not go to a bullfight. I find it completely inhumane, and I just want nothing to do with it in any way.
Fair enough. I guess I would probably boycott it too if I were there. The running of the bulls, maybe I'd watch that. That might be a different story.
Now, the running of the bulls in Pamplona, Spain, when you say watch, you would watch from somewhere where you would be guaranteed to be safe, like a balcony, a second floor or higher balcony, or would you be down where the bulls might actually pick you up and throw you around?
I think I would be somewhere safe, David. I don't really feel like having a horn go through my face or up my bum or anything like that.
Yeah, and it's funny because I feel like 10 years ago, you would have been all about participating, for the rush and the adrenaline, but now you see it differently.
I have changed. As I have gotten older, that is true, yes.
Let's go to your voicemails. Our voicemail number, 219-2DavidP. Let's listen to the first voicemail today.
Hey, David, this is Jeremy. Just watched your Glenn Beck has the smartest audience ever video. And as a former Mormon, I can tell you that Glenn Beck is taking a page right out of the Joseph Smith history with the idea of withholding information and giving it little bits at a time, pretending he already knows stuff that he can't tell you. I mean, that's all Mormon history 101 right there. In terms of whether or not he's a character, I can't say whether or not he chose to play a character, but I can say that Mormons are exceptionally good at deluding themselves to the point where they might actually believe it. So
yeah, on the first thing, a bunch of people emailed me about that, saying, Glenn Beck saying there are things he's been told but doesn't have permission to tell everybody yet, that is straight out of Mormon doctrine. It's funny, Lewis, because when we watch Glenn Beck, we just think he's nuts. We don't realize some of the stuff he says is straight out of Mormon doctrine.
Right. Well, I mean, not to offend anybody, but we would kind of put those two things in the same category, wouldn't we?
Well, I don't think all Mormons are crazy. Certainly not. I mean, I think if you literally believe the teachings of countless religions, you probably have some disconnection from reality. But that's different than being sociopathic, megalomaniac, or otherwise disconnected from reality. But they are kind of two separate things.
We can leave it at that, I guess.
Lewis doesn't want to get himself in trouble. I see exactly what's going on. All right, let's listen to one more voicemail here.
Hey, David, Lewis. I just watched that the Joni Ernst shot video again where she's shooting a gun, and I noticed something interesting. When she's loading the gun, it is pointed directly at the camera, which is clearly being held by a person, not on a tripod, because you see it move. Not exactly responsible gun ownership.
Yeah, that's interesting, Lewis. Is the campaign ad in which Joni Ernst touts herself as a responsible gun owner actually evidence that she's not a responsible gun owner because she pointed a gun as she was loading it at a person?
It is very brief. I did notice that. I don't recall if you can see the bullets in the mag when she loads it. I guess there's a chance that it was an empty clip as she put it into the gun, but it definitely was pointing right at the camera briefly.
Tomorrow is the Friday show, as we know, Lewis. The Friday show started earlier this month, and people are loving it. We do a whole audience questions segment where we just answer audience questions instead of playing voicemails at the end of the show. We have a flashback to a classic interview with new behind-the-scenes commentary. We do news stories. It's incredible. Friday show every Friday. On today's bonus show, the FBI is considering abandoning their marijuana policy. We have an incredible dinosaur find in my home country of Argentina, and we'll talk to you about fare dodging on the subway in Sweden. Sounds like a weird story, but I've been following it. It is fascinating what's happening in Sweden with their subway transit system and fare dodgers. That's all on today's bonus show. The bonus show is hosted by producer Lewis. I am the sidekick, and you can go to davidpakman.com/membership to sign up today and get access to all member benefits.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.